My love gifted me a bag of kumquats that sat gazing at me for a week. Bright and plump oval balls of sour. I finally take them and split them in half. This can be along any hemisphere, as long as they are split mostly equal. I throw them in a bowl and add enough salt to draw out their liquid and power up their flavor. I suppose it's a teaspoon. Now fold the salt in with the kumquats, gently, with honor and grace, so all the salt meets all the kumquat. I pull down the jar of the last of the acha masala I like to buy from my two favorite shops, one in Johannesburg and one in Cape Town. You could make your own from so many spices: kalonji, ajwain, bori, mustard seed. If you have none of these, at least it must have roasted chili, and it must have meti. It always has salt. Open up this jar and take a deep breath. These spices should draw up stories through your nostrils, enough for memories, enough for future recipes of the past. The smell sits firmly on a small yellow formica table in a kitchen with yellow wooden wall panels and built-in cupboards. The smell is in a small pickle bowl next to the chicken curry and a pile of plated rotis, closest to my grandfather's setting. The smell is on a Friday afternoon, mixed up just before the men come from Jummah prayer. I'm coming back to the kumquats. My memory was enough time to draw wetness from the fruit, at least 5 minutes. But this can even be overnight. I toss the fruit to meld the liquid and dissolve the salt a bit better. Taste one. Always taste as you go, so your mouth and your nose knows which ways to goes. I take a 4-finger pinch of acha masala and lay a base at the bottom of a clean jar, like carrot seeds in furrows in the soil, or the sprinkling of desiccated coconut on kusistas. I throw in a layer of the sliced kumquat, half oval suns beaming bright orange sour promises. They're so bright, the orangest orange in the kingdom. I take another 4-finger pinch of acha masala, then layer another level of kumquat, then acha masala, kumquats, acha masala, kumquats, and so on, until the jar is full, and if you have any left over, simply squash by will and force into the jar. Even when you squish them into ugly, their flavor will be grateful. Now top this up with sweet water, but you could also use watered down orange juice. If you must use tap water though, let it rest overnight with a loose cover to protect it from thirsty insects and dust. Chlorine seeks to kill bacteria, but is easily evaporated off. Now taste for saltiness. Always be reminded of the sea, even if you two have never met. Add more salt if there is not enough. It must be saltier than salty. If you had to weigh the kumquats first, this saltiness equates roughly 4% of kumquat weight, give or take. Close this jar tightly and leave it where you can see each other every day. Do not neglect this. Place the jar in a bowl or a saucer to catch any escaping liquids as the contents ferment. Bacteria are alive and, like you and me, rely on each other to reproduce. They release carbon dioxide as their loving uses oxygen. This forces liquids to ooze, sometimes after some days. You may leave the jar for at least a week and at most a month or 2. The longer, the bitterer. Bitterness here is not to be feared. There is a lesson in its initial longing for sweetness that is swiftly protected by a hand of masala and the thumping bass of super sour, salty, spicy citrus bursts. Ooh. Oh, that's so sour. It's so good. Ooh. Oh, so sour. So good. You don't need the sweet, just the memories of the summer midday sun reflecting throughout the kitchen. All the light through all the yellows, with bright orange in a small pickle bowl at the edge of a small yellow formica table. This recipe uses memory as a tool for grieving. So Princess Flay is a massive flay water body where we are traipsing around, and we're looking for what we can find as edibles. Let's cut across here. But also to say that Princess Flay is not the cleanest as it once was. So some of the stuff, if we do manage to find it, will be fermenting purely for sound quality, not for eating, and just to see what happens, because a lot of them can, this plant particular, Typha capensis, now it might get squelchy. Okay, so this is Typha capensis. Okay, these long, beautifully strappy plants. And capensis means from the Cape, not particularly this Cape, but like a Cape, so a peninsula style. And most parts of this plant are edible. The roots, all the white parts are edible, and then the flowering stem, which I'm hoping we're going to catch some maybe down that way, and just see if we can maybe grip some. If we can't, it's okay. Ooh, stanky. So they grow in very like bog conditions. I just want to see where we're at. Let me put my ass into it. Okay, so you can see the stem. So this whole section is edible. So in winter time, it's a nice time to get the shoots. So we'll just get a few of them. Also harvesting through all this grass, which makes it quite difficult. But we did it. And just try to clean off as much of the gunk as possible because it's nasty. And we got a shoot! Holla! And now, to make it easy, we just tie them up. So we're on our way to the sea to spend some time in the ecotone. of that coastal part of the shoreline that is just outside of the conservation zone. So one of the biggest kind of conservation political dramas that we have is around marine protected areas, because this idea of conservation is also a very colonial idea where like people are not allowed, you know, and the nature has to be pristine as if people are not of the nature. Which makes sense in the way that we have a very extractive habit and culture these days. But when you were born in that space and you've been harvesting there for generations, I don't think that should apply to you. So our harvesting, these days you need a permit to harvest, right? So you need to have a permit, which means you need to have an identity document, or at least know your ID number, and you need 94 rons, so you need money, and you need to find your way to a post office or other permit application place in order to be able to harvest. So we're going to a space that's just outside the marine protected area, which means we can harvest. We're doing it legally, quotation marks, with a permit, and we'll be doing it using best practice, which means that we'll harvest correctly, we won't over harvest, we'll take what we need, and we'll do it sparingly. We won't take all from one place, because it's not just us that eats from that land, but obviously all the homies, like the birds and the sea beings and all of that, the creatures that live there. But the reason we do that is because here we have a lot of pollution, especially from the ships and so on and so on. So we go to a space, so we're heading to a space that is cleaner, so that I don't have any fear of compromising immune system. Most of the time, because when I'm harvesting, it's most of the time it's for other people, and then I always just keep the leftovers for myself and for our family. So it's not like we're eating these foods every single day, so it works, and seaweed dries very beautifully. And if we feel that there's not a good harvest here, then we'll go down to the other side of the peninsula and see what we can see there. But I'm hoping we'll get what we need. But most of the thing that we're going to harvest is going to be seawater, because that's what we'll be using to ferment in the coming days, because we've got to prepare. We might be able to do it today or tomorrow, but we think of the ocean as the original brine, as the original saltwater preserver. And an ecotone is a space between ecosystems that has its ownness, its own diversity, its own way of being. And it always reminds me about like tonality in music, and how the spaces, like the tones and the microtones, and how in waveforms, and then also how that speaks to the ocean. But basically an ecotone in this particular case is the rocky shore between the sea and the mountain or the landscape. Another example of an ecotone would be like the borders of specific environments, you know? So like where the end of the Richtersveld or the Sunveld or the Renosterveld goes into Fynbos. So how there's that very specific line, and it might be because of geology, it might be because of habitat, it might be like there's so many reasons why they change, and sometimes they don't. There's no like reason for it. Without even saying a word, you can hear we're by the sea. Favorite place to be. So like in terms of ecotones and understanding ecotones, we are basically walking at the toes of the mountain. So the land rises up into the mountain where the geology like vastly changes, and then here we come down into the sea. just reflecting on best practice, and how it's become the practical, ethical gauge of how to utilize or engage in natural spaces, and how we need it now, because literally colonialism, neoliberal capitalism, and just this imperial way that we've all inherited has killed so much of our ways of knowing, and packaged into this idea of conservation where best practice is some kind of the same kind of knowledge as indigenous knowledge, like it borrows, at least, or it's a phantom of what indigenous knowledge is. It's this watered down version, enclosed with permits, kind of whitewashing of what we've always known, what we've always, what's been inherited. But it now kind of ensures that we are separate to nature, as opposed to being of nature. Okay, so like a very quick online search into the deepest time told me that the beginnings of the world, like as we know it, was when the temperatures cooled to 100 degrees Celsius. So this is when all the steam in the atmosphere rained into these big bodies of water, like which we call oceans, of course. And the salt that was already present in the planet starts to saturate the oceans from the landscape up, right? And from these volcanoes that there are. And then the land begins to form around these volcanoes, which then hold more space for freshwater bodies to form. And once we have both freshwater and saltwater, we see life form, like environments diversified and allowed for more life to flourish. And our oldest fossil is that of the cyanobacteria, right? And it's like possibly dated 4.3 billion years. But like, that doesn't necessarily mean that life, or as we call it, started then at 4.3 billion years, right? And in any case, cyanobacteria gave rise to what's called the Great Oxidation Event, which is maybe like 2.5 billion years ago. But I mean, like, all of this is give or take a few billion years. Because like back in the day, when life began, right? All the elements were in all different forms, and when eventually everything settled into the water, and all the bacteria rose to the light and became the first life forms, this gave rise to all other life forms, right? I mean, obviously. I mean, like you and me, hey? So much so that life evolved with bacteria as part of who we are, who they are. I mean, bacteria colonized every surface and adapted to every temperature even. There's now even bacteria everywhere, in underwater volcanoes, under every rock, every leaf, on all of our skin, in all of our insides, which technically are also our outsides. I mean, we're never alone. Bacteria are always with us. We are all ecosystems.